The Watership Down podcast is intended for listeners who are familiar with the plot. There will be spoilers. This episode is scripted, narrated, recorded and edited by Newell Fisher, with due credit to Chris Boyce, Solveig Singleton, the National Library of Scotland, Ordnance Survey and Google Earth. Hello, and welcome to the Watership Down podcast episode 182, in which, having reached the halfway point in the Netflix miniseries, we will be taking a one-episode break to return to a site visit that never happened. Confused? Then let me explain. And I will warn you now that this episode involves a return to pedantic geekery, the like of which has not been seen on this podcast since we analysed the infamous lost paragraph in episode 15. Be Tharn. Be very Tharn. The background history of this episode. As I have stated several times before, when I began this podcast in 2021, lockdown rules were still in place that made it illegal for me to travel to any of the places the book is set in. I decided from the start that a visual element of the podcast would be site visits to those places as soon as the restrictions were lifted. I also decided that I would visit those places in the order in which they appeared in the book. So it was that on Friday the 6th of August 2021 I drove to Newbury in Berkshire to film my first site visit, which covered Sandalford Warren and the journey to the River Enbourne. The YouTube film of this first visit was uploaded 2 days later on the 8th of August, and episode 24 of the podcast, published on the 10th of August 2021, was devoted to that site visit. This included the entire soundtrack of the YouTube film. That site visit ended on a gravel spit in the River Enbourne, right on the border between the counties of Berkshire, where the book opens, and Hampshire, where all the action takes place after the crossing of the River Enbourne. When I did my research for that visit, I missed the fact that Sandalford Park, where the book opens, does not extend all the way to the River Enbourne, which meant that after a stressful journey to Newbury, and by now tired and wet in the middle of the woods, I came across a sign saying, "Private, keep out." The timestamp for this is 8 minutes 50. Having come so far, I had two choices: stop and turn back, or trespass on private land. There was no practical way at that point to get permission to continue, so my exact words on the video at that point were, quote, "Just come past a private keep out sign, but that's not going to stop me. I've come too far." End quote. I subsequently apologised for trespassing in episode 24 as well as in the notes for the YouTube, but at the time, in the middle of that dense wood, my decision seemed obvious. Just 3 weeks after this first site visit, on the August Bank Holiday Monday of 2021, our lives were changed forever by my father's devastating stroke, which ultimately led to his death in May of this year, 2024. Both myself and my wife moved into my parents' house to become their carers, and this podcast only kept going as a weekly podcast during that incredibly stressful period due to the invaluable help of Captain of Owsler John Ruths. In fact, it was this that led to his promotion to that role. Once the dust had settled a little, I began planning for site visit 2 in April of 2022. I planned for this visit to start at the southern bank of the River Enbourne, right by where the last visit had ended. It would then have covered the Beanfield, the road, Newtown Church and Common, and possibly also Cowslips Warren. This time I was a lot more thorough with my research, establishing exactly who owned the land north and south of the River Enbourne and getting in touch with the landowners in order to get full permission to film there. And at first this went really well, with the landowners even offering to help me get access to the site of Cowslips Warren, which also lies on private land. And then, nothing. All communication dried up. I tried several times to get back in touch, but also always received no response. I sadly began to realise that my slightly spectrum ambition to visit the settings of the book in order was not going to happen. In the end, I gave up. I also decided that future site visits would be fully integrated episodes of the podcast, with the filmed version being on YouTube and the audio on Spotify. So, Site Visit 1 is unique in not being a podcast episode in itself. So it was that episode 108 was a site visit to Watership Down, and episode 137 a visit to Ephrata. But I have never forgotten that original plan for site visit 2. And I think I now know what might have happened. There could of course be other explanations, in fact I rather hope there are. As part of my discussions with the landowner, I urged them to watch my first site visit, and I don't think I referred to my trespass at all when I did so. Why, I cannot really explain. It just didn't seem important at the time, as I was being completely above board in requesting access to their land. However, I now think it is likely that when they saw the video, the fact that I had trespassed annoyed them, and that was why communication ended. I would really like to think that one day I will stand on the southern bank of the Enbourne with full permission to do so. Bearing in mind the events of the last 3 years in our family, it would actually be quite a poignant moment for me. I know this site isn't one that is particularly significant for fans of the film versions of Watership Down, which was why I ended up not worrying that much about having missed it out. But it would be good to cover the rest of the journey to Watership Down from the book, and this location is one of the best described landscapes in it. So, in the meantime, and in the absence of a physical site visit, I have decided to put together a virtual site visit, centering on the location of the Beanfield that features in chapters 9 and 10 of the book, and using the best information I have available to me. There is going to be a video version of this episode, but that will be a slightly different version to this audio version. This is one episode where just lifting the audio from a YouTube film really is not going to work, as the amount of visual detail is far too high. So, this episode will explain the facts in audio form as best I can, and I will let you know when the video version is out. I'm not going to wait until the video version is ready before releasing this episode, and the full YouTube version of this episode will still be audio only. Also, the video version will be a lot shorter than this episode and will miss out the sob story I've just told, focusing purely on the facts, with lots of maps and annotated aerial pictures to make my explanation absolutely clear. So then, let's look for the Beanfield. The evidence from the book. In the original novel of Watership Down, there are 4 boundaries mentioned between the River Enbourne and the road, as Hazel scouts out the landscape between them. In my beloved 1978 Puffin edition of Watership Down, the first of these occurs in the second paragraph of chapter 9, The Crow and the Beanfield, on page 50. It reads, quote, "He came to a wide gap which had been trodden into mud by cattle. He could see them grazing in the next field further up the slope." End quote. The second boundary is on page 51 in the middle of the third paragraph. Quote, "Fascinated, he ran to the crest. Nearby was another hedgerow, and beyond, moving gently in the breeze, stood a field of broad beans in full flower." End quote. This is obviously a description of Hazel finding the space in which the Beanfield lies. The third boundary is mentioned in chapter 10, The Road and the Common. It is on page 57, one sentence into the second to last paragraph. Quote, "He looked cautiously out from among the beans and then darted into the hedgerow. The wind, as he stopped to sniff it, was reassuring, carrying only the sense of evening dew, may and cow dung. He led the way into the next field, a pasture." End quote. And the fourth and last boundary is mentioned on page 58 at the start of the third to last paragraph. Quote, "They ran on and crept through the hedge. Hazel looked down at the road in astonishment. For a moment he thought he was looking at another river, black, smooth and straight between its banks. Then he saw the gravel embedded in the tar." End quote. This last boundary is obviously what brings the rabbits to the road. More specifically, the B4640 as it approaches the A339 at Newtown just south of Newbury. So then, that is the evidence that Richard Adams provided us with in the book for the location of the Beanfield within this landscape. So what about the geography of the place? The geographical evidence. In episode 59 of this podcast, published in April 2022, I thanked 2 listeners and welcomed them to the Owsler before starting my analysis of the first 4 minutes of the 1978 film. They were Chris Boyce and Solveig Singleton. At that point, Site Visit 2 was still very much a possibility, and I was very interested in getting as much advice and information as possible. On the smaller of the 2 Watership Down fans groups on Facebook, Chris had pointed me to an invaluable resource that would enable me to compare Ordnance survey maps of the locations from the book. This turned out to be absolutely crucial. The site is the National Library of Scotland and can be found at maps.nls.uk. There will be a link in the notes. As for Solveig, well, on the larger of the 2 Watership Down fans groups on Facebook, she made a simple suggestion that kind of unlocked the mystery of where the Beanfield might be in that landscape. Their comments were in response to an appeal I had put out as I tried to prepare for Site Visit 2. My appeal, posted on the 11th of April 2022, was as follows, quote, "I'm trying to trace the exact location of the Beanfield in chapters 9 and 10 of the book, but I've hit a problem. I'm missing a hedgerow. In this picture is what I think is the route the rabbits take from the Enbourne to the road, including 3 hedgerows. The fields are very narrow and I cannot see traces of a hedgerow that has been taken up." End quote. I included a picture from Google Earth of the landscape in question, along with arrows indicating what I assumed was the route the rabbits took from the river to the road. And a picture of this landscape is the image for this episode, with thanks to Google Earth. Chris Boyce's suggestion of checking old Ordnance survey maps was an excellent one, but it just deepened the mystery. Because the field boundaries of this small area had remained basically completely unchanged since the beginning of the 20th century, which meant that the present landscape was fundamentally exactly the same as that which Richard Adams, born in 1920, had known in his childhood and teenage years as he explored the landscape that would one day become the setting of his first novel. So where was the missing hedgerow? Let me describe this landscape in a little more detail. From the site of the crossing of the Enbourne at a southerly bend in the river where the brook that runs from Sandalford meets it, as indicated on the map at the beginning of my 1978 edition, a long hedgerow runs to the south-east, ending at the road. Running from south-west to north-east, 3 hedgerows emanate from this hedgerow, the last of which lies right by the road. I made the assumption that the route the rabbits took from river to road was a straight line through these hedgerows, but this only provided 3 boundaries, not 4. What's more, the space between the second and third boundary is a very small space in which a beanfield, of the kind described in the book, looks as if it would barely fit. In making this assumption, I could have been accused of linear thinking. It just looked like the shortest route to the road. However, Solveig Singleton earned her Owsler membership at one stroke with this simple suggestion. Quote, "I don't read the text as referring to 3 hedgerows. One of the references might be to one off to the side." End quote. She also made the observation, quote, "I figure rabbits don't go in straight lines." End quote. And at one stroke, I started to look at this landscape in an entirely different light. Why should the Beanfield lie in a direct line between the river and the road? I began to look at the area on the other side of the hedgerow that ran south-east from the river. This seemingly contains a large area of pasture with no equivalent hedgerow to the first one described in the book, the only barriers being a continuation of the hedgerow proposed by the road and the one to the northwest of that. This, crucially, provided a plausible 4-boundary route from river to road, provided that the route involved a right-angled turn to the southwest after the first boundary, arriving at the Beanfield through the second boundary, followed by a turn back to the southeast when leaving the Beanfield, followed by the third boundary. Given Hazel's having been guided by the smell of the Beanfield, as well as no explicit reference to the route continuing in a straight line, and also the proposed space for the Beanfield now being very large, the solution suddenly seemed so obvious. And this remains my conclusion as to where the Beanfield lies in the book to this day. It goes without saying that if you have any information that may help to improve on any of what I have said, please do get in touch via the usual channels, because I want to get this right. So, was this a Beanfield in Richard Adams' early life, or indeed later in his life when he was writing Watership Down? We may never know. But Despite not being one of the best known locations in the book, it does remain one of the landscapes described in the most detail in the whole story. It is tempting to think that there was a reason for that, such as, for example, Richard Adams having a childhood memory of a large, fragrant beanfield as he wandered the landscape close to where he lived. A landscape he would one day immortalise in his first novel, Watership Down. Next time, we return to the 2018 Netflix miniseries as we reach episode 3, The Escape, and the search for Hazel begins in the fog. And there is another major departure from the original story.